This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for January 16th, 2020, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi, checkers.
We have a great show for you today. I'm going to talk to you about the future of work. And then Adam is going to explore whether one should ingest one's placenta after birth.
That's right.
But first, impeachment. Pat, is this in the news or something? What do you want to talk to us about?
We actually got a couple of emails and tweets about this from listeners. We even got one from John Abrams, the original host of this podcast.
Who?
They were all similar, but I'll read one we got from a different John since his came first. He said, "Happy New Year, checkers. Predictions are hard, especially about the future. But it's much easier to fact check about past events. And on the podcast, you said President Trump was not impeached in 2019. In fact, he was. I hope this helps." And he sent us a Wikipedia link about the impeachment of Donald Trump. John and these other folks that wrote in are referring to our year-end wrap-up show, which we did last week, where Adam was assessing our predictions about 2019. And indeed, during that segment, Adam said that Donald Trump had not been impeached in 2019. Now, to be fair, I think both when the predictions were made and when Adam was assessing them, the crew was thinking in terms of removal from office.
That's what I was thinking, and I definitely didn't have a nuanced understanding of the term.
Right. But this is in fact not what impeachment is. The worst part about this making it into the show is that I should have known enough to say something because a few weeks earlier I was working on a segment about the impeachment process in the United States. While I was working on that segment, coincidentally, friend of the show, Professor Buzzkill, put out an episode on his podcast about the subject, so I just sort of put it on the back burner. Now, this is meant to be a really quick correction with a bit of an overview, so if you're a constitutional lawyer, don't write into the show.
No, please do.
Actually, do write in. We can have you on.
Actually, if you are a constitutional lawyer with a decent microphone, do write into the show, and maybe we'll have you on. So I'm going to try to just stick to the what is it part rather than getting into the specifics of what is currently going on or whether it's justified or a witch hunt and all the other stuff we hear surrounding it. All right, so what is impeachment? Congress derives the authority from the U.S. Constitution. While the term impeachment is often used to mean removing someone from office, as was the case with Adam last week, it actually just refers to the filing of formal charges. Once the House impeaches or files these charges, then the Senate holds a trial on those charges to decide whether the officer, which can be a president or any other federal official, should be removed from holding office and barred from holding office in the future. The Constitution says presidents or other federal officials can be impeached for, quote, treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. No president has faced impeachment articles for treason or bribery. All of those impeachment cases so far came down to what Congress considers to be high crimes and misdemeanors. That phrase, high crimes and misdemeanors, is not defined in the Constitution, leaving it up to Congress to decide what qualifies in any particular case. Historians and legal scholars say it is generally understood to mean a serious abuse of the public trust. It's important to note, though, that impeachment is a political process and not a criminal one.
So even if the person is impeached, they're not criminally liable or facing jail time or anything as a result of that decision?
That's correct. Congress has no power to actually criminally charge anyone. So the House can vote to impeach with a simple majority vote on any of the articles, and it is the case that they voted to pass 2 articles of impeachment related to Donald Trump on December 18th, 2019. Strangely, even the House of Representatives website has not yet been updated to reflect this. Impeachment in the House is not enough to remove, say, the president from office, though. The Senate then holds an impeachment trial and ultimately votes on whether or not to convict or acquit the person on the articles approved by the House. A 2/3 majority of senators need to vote for conviction in order for the official, in this case the president, to be removed from office. And based on what we know right now, this looks really unlikely to happen. The House has impeached 19 people in U.S. history. Turns out that most of these were federal judges. but 3 presidents have been impeached, and that's what got me interested in this topic originally. A news story I saw said that the 2 presidents to have been impeached prior to Donald Trump are Bill Clinton and Andrew Johnson, both of who were acquitted by the Senate. But wait a minute, what about Richard Nixon? It turns out Nixon was not impeached because he resigned before the House voted on the articles of impeachment. So there you have it. John is quite correct that Donald Trump was impeached by the House of Representatives on December 18th, 2019. Yesterday, today being January 16th, the House delivered those articles of impeachment to the Senate. The House also approved 7 Democrats to serve as prosecutors, called managers, in the Senate trial. Some preliminary steps of the trial started today, including the reading of articles of impeachment and the swearing in of senators. Arguments are expected to begin next Tuesday. So, thanks to everyone who took the time to write in about this.
If I can make another prediction, given the current state of political polarization, the next time there's a Democratic president, that president will be impeached. Because I think that's just going to be a thing that's going to be more and more common because it's a thing they can do.
Adam making the multi-year prediction.
That's right. This is down the road, but here you go. That's very interesting, Pat. Obviously, I completely misunderstood the meaning. If there's sort of a common meaning of that term, it's probably just wrong and being misused, and that's the way I thought of it. I appreciate the clarification, and I appreciate everyone who wrote in to kind of school us. Apparently, our listeners pay attention to these kind of things.
You were correct. The popular narrative is that 3 American presidents have been impeached. One of them is Nixon.
Yeah.
In that case, because you mentioned this before and I looked it up, it really was like a week or 2 away from it happening, and he just resigned instead. Work. Work, 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 work. Imagine I sang the whole song. Anyway, we don't discuss work that much on the show, although we do work. Mm-hmm. Although we did discuss teleworking years ago and the failures of open office concepts, as well as some disagreement about technological unemployment. Shout out to you, Elon. This week, though, I thought I'd provide an overview of a report I read about the future of work. The report is by Policy Horizons Canada, which is a Canadian foresight organization, which is not the same as forecasting. Mm-hmm. I present their ideas not for a rigorous analysis of how the world is at the moment or is going to be, but to stimulate discussion on how we think work might change in the next 10 to 20 years. In short, various ideas for your brain to munch on and generate other ideas.
The robots are coming to kill us all.
Spoiler alert.
Mm-hmm.
In general, though, foresight, the purpose of it is to analyze current trends and other indicators of change to describe different plausible futures to then have a more informed understanding of what could be possible and to possibly change policy, which is different than forecasting, which is trying to be far more precise and say something specific will happen with a certain, say, percentage estimate if you're trying to be rigorous about it.
So Minority Report is what you're saying.
Yes, it uses many popular references as you can. It's like The Matrix meets Minority Report meets Terminator 2 and part of another Terminator movie.
Ooh, I would love this film.
Yeah. Nearly all the insights and implications I'm sharing are from the report. Mostly they're direct quotes or paraphrases. So if you hear anything insightful, it's probably not me. The report describes what they call 5 key game changers for the future of work. I'll list all 5 now and then describe each a bit more in turn. Number 1, work moves from being long-term and time-based to temporary and task-based. Number 2, AI and automation of tasks could put people out of work long before technologies replace entire jobs. 3, AI decreases the scarcity of knowledge workers, potentially allowing jobless growth in knowledge industries. Number 4, combined digital technologies could reduce the need for human intermediaries who provide trust and security. And number 5, where people work and earn may not be where they live and spend.
What is meant by jobless growth, Darren? Just that industries would grow regardless of employees?
You wouldn't need to hire more employees, but you could still grow through automation. But you should wait till I elaborate on number 3, Pat.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So number 1, work moves from being long-term and time-based to temporary and task-based. The gist here is that supported by digital technologies, jobs are broken down into many distinct tasks, and these tasks can be accomplished separately, and then they can be recombined to achieve desired result. In this way, you can have payment for tasks rather than time spent. A lot of people are on salaries, but there could be a shift towards completing a specific task. It basically separates the overall work from the tasks themselves. You can separate them out.
So kind of like commission for sales only applying to a lot of other types of jobs that it couldn't really
like the
apply
gig
to.
economy writ large.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then as more jobs are unbundled into tasks, more work can be uploaded to task-based labor platforms. Whether you have your Mechanical Turk or online interfaces, and this then might change how compensation goes, of course, from, say, a salary or even hourly to just task-based. Mm-hmm. Which then you could imagine ripples through the economy. Another factor here is that task-based work and compensation relies heavily on reputation systems. So if you think of maybe the good example is something like Uber or something like that, one of the reasons it works so well is because there's a rating system and there's trust in other things. But right now, yes, there's an understanding if you're a salaried employee, if you're trustworthy and capable, but it's not at all the same as like an online Yelp review for each person. Yeah. And even perhaps each person per task. So the implications here could be that this new model ripples through a lot of the economy. The traditional employer-employee relationships become less common. And you could imagine that some firms, they might offer goods and services, but they're so heavily automated, they actually have very few or no workers. Yeah. If that occurs, then this could strain social support systems such as pensions, private health benefits, and training that depend largely on traditional employer-employee relationships in the context of a firm. And the uneven distribution of digitally driven employment and wage losses could lead to greater inequality. Building on number one, if you can unbundle a series of tasks for a particular job, you now then may be able to automate some of those tasks. Yeah. Well, you couldn't automate the overall job. Well, you might be able to automate various parts of it. Mm-hmm. And this is that many jobs fall into the partially automated. And so with trucking, say, there could be new situations where there's a lead trucker, which has a human in the cab, and there's many trucks behind it that are all automated, and many other designs where robots have a hand in assisting humans, like say in stocking factories or distributing goods and services, maybe from Amazon warehouses. Mm-hmm. An interesting implication here is that currently robots don't function well in environments that have currently been built for humans. But you can imagine in the future, certain warehouses, they'll be built for robots. And that humans may have trouble interacting in them, at least with ease, compared to what we're used to, because it's not really built for us.
There's no oxygen, for example.
Wait, they went to the effort of removing the oxygen atom, yes.
On the moon, maybe. But your example of truckers makes me think of things like, maybe you have automated driving, but you still need someone to accompany the goods to unload, offload, depending on the product, depending on the challenges, right? So some of those might not be necessary, but some of those might be sort of one task is replaced, but not everything in that workflow is, right?
Right.
So the way I heard that, Darren, was that there's one vehicle and then a bunch of autonomous vehicles are following it. And I'm not sure at all how that would work at all.
Right. Sorry. I meant to say they're all autonomous, or generally mostly autonomous, where the lead one has a human in it, even though it is generally autonomous also, either as a transition move for the comfort of other humans just to understand what's happening. Mm-hmm. And it may be the case that if you're out in the world, and yes, GPS and everything, Internet of Things becomes far more linked and far more accessible, it's good to have some human somewhere in case something does go awry.
So the idea, if there was a problem, he could stop the whole group.
Correct. So aside from the general implications of if you're unbundled all these work tasks into specific things and then they're automated, you can imagine it ripples through the economy. There's maybe less employment. There's structural unemployment, and maybe it's over the long term. Often this stuff is cyclical, but maybe it just doesn't really come back. This is something we have talked about before on the show. Could people who had these previous tasks now that are being automated be retrained or reskilled? I think that's highly unlikely. Number 3, AI ends the scarcity of knowledge workers, potentially allowing jobless growth in knowledge industries. And the idea here is that adding knowledge-based work capacity currently requires resources to recruit, train, compensate, and manage additional humans. Sure. But firms may be able to duplicate AI designed to collect and apply task-specific knowledge at near zero marginal cost. This offers firms a low-cost alternative to hiring additional humans with all their traditional financial and human resource costs. This is already occurring in several knowledge-based sectors, mainly in the realm of accounting and finance and data science and even human resources. Mm-hmm. You could imagine that a lot of what people might do in a particular job, like, well, now a lot of it can be automated. And if a lot of it can be automated, those algorithms can be easily duplicated to do more and more, and the humans will do less and less. Mm-hmm. So what they're trying to say is that the knowledge work, which we often thought is more difficult, can be broken down, and then you could just have replication of those entities that can do that knowledge work. Mm-hmm. Thus the jobless growth.
This has happened with other technological innovations in the past. It hasn't necessarily caused less employment, but it has caused for a greater capacity of work throughput, right? So with the same number of people, you have tools to be able to just do a way better job of it, right? But that is obviously going to depend on job for job, and this is a different technology than we've seen in the past, for sure.
Right. So you could imagine instead of a large hiring process at some career fair, we're like, well, we got a good AI or some algorithms that can replicate them, and we can just update them instead of hiring new actual humans.
Yeah.
So there would be economic growth for those firms, but not because they're adding human jobs.
Yeah.
And then another suggestion is that maybe this would be captured by mega firms. And the idea here is that while it is possible to do this, usually you need a lot of resources and access to big data and have the sophistication to actually go through it in different ways to gain a lot of the value from it.
Yes. It probably depends on the sector, but some of these technologies are fairly accessible in certain fields. Maybe in some they're very much not, where it's much more complicated, but computer technology to facilitate work has generally been something that's been available to anyone who has a computer or a server, right?
Right. Number 4, combined digital technologies could reduce the role of and need for human intermediaries. Basically, there are a lot of humans that do a lot of intermediary work. Yeah. Someone has to sign a contract. Someone else has to notarize it. Someone else is involved because how can you trust someone else? Well, blockchain technologies can provide assurance that fosters trust in many transactions. You can just remove human guarantors, such as bank workers and lawyers. You could have sensors built into the Internet of Things that can determine when a product or service is required. So the loss of white-collar jobs could be extensive across sectors. And this has made me think like, okay, yeah, I know what certain people do with their time, but say how much of a lawyer's job is really just there to vouch for 2 other parties doing something. And depending on the law you're doing, maybe it's a lot, maybe it's a little. Mm-hmm. And then finally, where people work and earn may not be where they live and spend. Mm-hmm. And I think this just has the idea that if you're just doing certain tasks, you can do that from anywhere. With a greater connectivity, with greater access to different types of people on Earth, Wi-Fi access. You're like, well, I could be in a different country. I could work at a different time. This is already happening to some extent. But if the other changes also happen, then you could imagine happening even more so.
I feel like the technology for that has existed for decades, but people are only sort of starting to embrace it a little more and more.
Right. And then we can ramp it up. As they suggest, advanced telepresence allows workers to perform physical tasks from a remote location. So aside from, say, surgery, you could imagine someone who's very sophisticated, who has a certain set of skills. They're using an interface which allows them to do surgery in a different country on someone else. There could be even more dangerous elements of, say, mining, where there's some sort of mech that someone is piloting in some way.
Oh, nice.
Let's get to the good stuff. So there could be then, if you break down geographic restrictions on employment, a highly competitive global labor market, which is already occurring in some ways. Yes. If you're in certain industries, whether it be military, defense, or government, you're typically protected, even though there are definitely people in other countries that could do the same job for a much cheaper price, even if it's multiple people involved.
Well, we've seen this kind of outsourcing happen. It started out with call centers, but it's been happening on all sorts of tech fields. If your cost for skilled labor is lower in another country, it will be profitable for a company to run people out of there.
Exactly. Another implication I thought was interesting is that if you have something like the resource extraction sector, which usually has a lot of human infrastructure needs around wherever they're extracting resources, if that is changed, where it's being largely automated or just requiring less attention from humans and other people, the secondary economies from those local communities may be affected, which then ripples through. So if you don't have a lot of people working in a particular place, well, they don't need goods and services. Anyway, so I just wanted to share those ideas, what the future of work might be like. Again, it's not definitive, but it seems plausible that a lot of these things will happen in some way, and it could dramatically change how we see work in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
A lot of it is extrapolation of current trends, but there's a lot of sort of emerging technologies in there. So it's a really kind of interesting way to think about a lot of things.
Well, you could look at it another way, like what seems like it won't happen. Well, automation's going to increase. Yes. Will they unbundle certain tasks? In certain industries, yes, they're already doing it. So I didn't think they presented that many things were unreasonable. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And now Adam, with everyone's favorite topic, eating placentas after birth.
In the past few years, I've been on the sidelines for a number of baby deliveries, and one thing I've never done is eat the placenta. This is apparently a real thing. Now, I'd heard of the option to keep the placenta for stem cells and maybe some rumblings of some cultures that like to eat the placenta, but this certainly didn't apply to me. Some people do eat either the cooked placenta or dried up placenta in pill form after giving birth, claiming it has a number of benefits. This, they claim, is an ancient practice. Now, would anyone like to take a guess as to how ancient this is?
2017.
I like that.
No,
I like that one.
I think the past several decades, even though it's tempted to stick in a goop snipe in there.
I was going to make a goop joke.
All right. So no one's going with like, the year 304. Okay. So you kind of...
There must be some group somewhere that did it, but maybe they died out and we don't know.
Maybe. Now, what if I said it went way, way, way back to 1971?
I'd say I was right.
Yeah, that's close to what
Actually,
you guys are saying.
no, I should clarify. When I said decades, I mentally thought like the 60s, 70s, but because it's 2020, that only takes us to the 90s.
Yeah.
So apparently I've gotten older and I have to update how far time is ago.
Yeah, 1971 is not even 50 years ago.
Oh boy.
Now, a couple weeks ago, I stumbled upon an NPR article on the topic, which referenced an article by Jen Gunter, who we've mentioned on the show many times before. Now, despite the ancient-seeming mystique, the habit of eating placenta after giving birth isn't much older than I am. But I have to quantify that statement a bit. I'm talking specifically about the practice of the mother ingesting the placenta after giving birth. This is said to infer many protections against postpartum depression by reducing stress, and is also said to increase milk production and improve energy. Now, even looking back at the example from 1971, which appeared in a 1972 issue of Rolling Stone, there doesn't even appear to be any medical claims associated with it. And I'm quoting here, "I wouldn't look at the baby until he was all the way out, his cord still attached to the placenta inside me. Bill cut the cord and Doris wrapped him and handed him to me. I held him, but I was so wasted I handed him to his father. Then I pushed the placenta out into a pot. It looked magnificent, purple and red and turquoise. Then me and Bill and the baby crawled into bed together, and everyone left except Rebecca, who stayed behind to steam the placenta, which I ate and shared with my friends. It was wonderfully replenishing and delicious." So this wasn't done to avoid postpartum depression, increase milk production, or anything of the sort. This woman lived in some sort of hippie commune and admits to being wasted, so I won't even attempt to ascertain her specific motives. Midwife Raven Lang of California is credited with bringing the practice back. She claims that it has ancient roots in traditional Chinese medicine. Indeed, eating placenta does appear in Li Shizhen's Compendium of Materia Medica, published in 1596. So that is ancient. I'll give it that. But this reference has nothing to do with postpartum depression or increasing milk production, and it's not recommended as something one should take after childbirth. It is said to have invigorated people, to treat infertility and impotence. Indeed, a woman who just gave birth to a child certainly doesn't need to treat her infertility, and she would have little use for something which would treat impotence for probably at least a few weeks.
Yeah, but what about the rest of the people in your village? Obviously, you are fertile because you just had a baby, so you could see some logic, quote unquote.
Spread it around. In that one example, yes, but the current usage that is going around is mothers taking it after giving birth. Now, a deep dive into many classical Chinese texts uncovered no mainstream traditional practices of consuming placenta after the child's birth in China. There are no pre-industrialized societies in which eating the placenta was common, so it likely didn't go that far back. Now, if they did, that wouldn't necessarily mean it's a good idea, but there isn't really evidence that that's something that's happened. But most people don't have the stomach to cook and eat placenta, which by all indications is not terribly tasty. That's what some of the people said. Instead, people dry them up, put them in pills, which they later ingest. And by that, I mean, some people are more than willing to take desperate mothers' money to do them the service of drying and encapsulating their placenta. Usually runs from $200 to $400.
No.
Yeah. So it's a hot practice, and some celebrity moms who've consumed their placenta include Miam Bialik, that's Blossom, January Jones, who's Emma Frost in the X-Men First Class film, Alicia Silverstone, who's Batgirl and in Clueless, and Chrissy Teigen, she's big on social media and married to John Legend, and two Kardashians. They have a lot of money. So, how does this work? Well, do we have to evaluate the claims which may have been made up by a doula in California and some hippie commune? Well, if we didn't evaluate those kind of claims, we wouldn't have much of a show, would we? Now, the evidence is not there. There were never any double-blinded controlled trials to prove this. The basis is not born out of some research lab or because the ingredients were tied to some benefit and then they decided to lead to this practice of ingesting it. When it comes to pills, there isn't enough iron in it, but not enough to make a big difference. There's a bit of hormones, estradiol and progesterone, which is actually more concerning than promising because estrogen in the first month after delivery can have a negative rather than positive effect on milk supply. It can also cause blood clots, which is a major concern for women who've just given birth. Now, when patients claim that it worked for them, it's almost impossible to quantify this. Women don't have babies every day, so what's the control? What are they comparing it to? Okay, so you ate your placenta and your milk production increased. Compared to what? Milk production usually starts in the first hours after birth. Some women have a bit of trouble at first, and then production comes more easily. There's also colostrum, which is a substance that makes up the first drops of breast milk that come out, and it's very thick, and it doesn't flow like milk. So as it's more concentrated, there's less of it. Normal milk comes later. Milk production would seem to increase. So if someone is ingesting this after birth, I can see how they would think that their milk production has increased.
Good old post hoc fallacy.
Yeah. Now, I doubt patients are specifically comparing milk production from instances with or without placentophagy, that's the act of ingesting placenta, but even if they were, milk production and lactation usually comes much more easily with successive children, so that wouldn't be a good control. I had trouble lactating on my first baby, I ate the placenta on my second baby, and I produced more milk. You produced more milk because it was your second baby. As for postpartum stress and energy, these are vague claims which are hard to gauge, but it's easy to get caught up in the hormones and the sense of euphoria which comes with childbirth, so it would be really hard to tease anything out of all that. Ultimately, one argument for the practice is that many species of mammals do it, and this is absolutely true. It's not known exactly why a lot of animals do it, but they do. But why should we care? While many mammals do it, there's one species that absolutely doesn't, and that's humans, and this should be an indicator. Our placenta is quite different than that of other mammals, mostly because humans usually give birth to one child at a time instead of a litter, and our placenta has evolved to adapt to that practice. If there was an advantage to consuming it, we would have evolved the practice of doing so. Quite to the contrary, if there is no advantage or a cost to consuming it, then we would have evolved away from the practice, which appears to be the case. Even in times of famine, there are no documented cases of people eating their placenta, so we aren't evolved to eat them even when calories are scarce.
Now, while that may be generally true, we don't know for sure that that's true. Meaning that we know there are certain cases where something is a bit negative for us and we haven't evolved away from it because it's left over or has some other impact for something else, right?
Yeah.
We're not evolved to be the best at everything,
Yep.
just optimized to our environment, which always is shifting and malleable. So it could be the case that you could imagine, as an evolutionary just so story, eating placenta was beneficial, but then a cultural practice took hold, and the cultural practice conferred some sort of benefit. I'm not saying group selection, but all that to say is that it's not so clear cut. That if it was beneficial, we would do it, and because we don't do it, it isn't.
Sure. But, if that were the case, there might be cultural taboos or something like that, which we don't really hear, even though people may find it kind of gross. I think there's sort of a cultural taboo against cannibalism in general.
Well, people finding it kind of gross maybe is the cultural taboo. The very idea of it is unappealing, I would assume, to most people, but that's an empirical question.
Yeah. So it's hard to gauge, but I think you're right there, Darren. As for other things that animals do, Jen Gunter gives the example of her gerbil, who ate her young, and cats who eat grass to make themselves vomit, as activities that are performed by mammals, which we shouldn't be emulating because their bodies are a little different than ours. So don't eat your placenta. Don't pay someone to make little pills out of it so that you can take it. You won't get anything out of it. It's not an ancient practice. It's the General Tso's chicken of medicine. It's invented in California or someplace in the U.S. and passed off as something authentically Chinese. Don't be fooled.
If you take anything away from this show, know that eating your placenta is the General Tso's chicken of medicine. There's your phrase.
Yep.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for joining us once again, listeners. Pat talked to us about impeachment, clarifying that it's a two-step process, and indeed Donald Trump has been impeached. We'll see if he's actually convicted in a trial in the Senate. Unlikely. I talked to you about some ideas about the future of work, largely related to automation, task unbundling, and other things that might ripple through an economy. And finally, Adam talked to us about how you shouldn't eat your placenta. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smartassy.
We'll talk to you next week, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay,
So the
cool,
word
cool.
pensions was really weird. If you could say that sentence again.
Pensions. Just the word of the whole thing.
No, the whole thing.
That's what I thought.